Now, since that terrible day in 1968, when Dr. King was so brutally assassinated, the size of the black middle class has more than tripled. But at the same time, the percentage of black children living at or beneath the poverty line in the year 2000 was 35%. Roughly what it was on the terrible day when Dr. King was murdered. We have two nations within the African American community. They're both black, yet they're divided by the chasm of class. Is this class divide permanent? Are we the generation presiding over permanent class division in the African American community? Only history and time will tell. For the black community, it's the best of times, and it's sadly the worst of times. Consider the following statistics. In Chicago, where I home, to take just one typical example, 45% of all black men between the ages of 20 and 24 are both out of work and out of school. 1 in 5 black males in their 20s in Chicago is in prison on probation or parole. 69% of all black households in Chicago are headed by single parents. Only 45% of all blacks in Chicago are gainfully employed in any given week. That's of all ages. And the average lifespan for black males in Chicago is 59. Are our people better off today, 50 years after Brown, than we were before Brown? Or does the class divide within the African American community argue that, as a whole, we are worse off? Why are so many members of the black community faring so badly when so very many of us are doing well? These, and of course many other issues, our panelists are here to discuss this afternoon. And let me introduce them in alphabetical, more or less alphabetical order. Sheryll Cashin. Sheryll Cashin knows where you live, and she doesn't like it. Many of the questions raised during this 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board center around educational opportunities and access. Professor at Georgetown University's Law Center, Sheryll begins her examination of these questions from the perspective of residential segregation in her marvelous book entitled The Failures of Integration, How Race and Class Are Undermining the American Dream, which was published earlier this year. Where our children go to school and where they live are, of course, inextricably intertwined. But Professor Cashin asked us to look at our neighborhood's de facto segregation as the root cause of the lack of equal opportunity and equal access which continue to characterize this country even after Brown effectively ended de jure segregation. Professor Cashin joined the Georgetown Law Faculty in 1997 after a decade working in private and public sectors. She received her bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt, a master's degree from the University of Oxford, and her law degree from Harvard. She worked as a law clerk to great Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And in the Clinton-Gore administration, she was the staff director for the Community Empowerment Board in the Office of the Vice President and the Director of Community Development for the National Economic Council at the White House. The Failures of Integration is one of the most important books published this year. It's my pleasure today to welcome its author, Sheryll Cashin, to Market. Lani Guinier. Lani Guinier ascended the national stage in 1993 when President Bill Clinton nominated this dedicated civil rights attorney and brilliant legal scholar to head the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where she had served during the Carter administration. The scene, as we all know, ended terribly. The professional and activist record impugned and sensationalized, and Clinton's unfortunate withdrawal of her nomination. A low point for me in the Clinton administration. I'm happy to say that Lani Guinier never left the national stage, thank God. Hers is one of the most sought-after voices in debates surrounding voting rights, political representation, issues of race and gender, and in this year of Brown's 50th anniversary, educational equity and equal access. Lani Guinier is the Bennett Bosky Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School where she became the first African-American woman with tenure in 1998. Graduate of Radcliffe College and the Yale School of Law, Professor Guinier had tenured the University of Pennsylvania Law School for 10 years before joining Harvard. In the 1980s, she helmed the Voting Rights Project at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Professor Guinier is the author of many books, including The Tyranny of the Majority and Lift Every Voice, a memoir inspired by the nomination mailing. She's a co-author of Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law School and Institutional Change, of The Miner's Canary, and finally of Who's Qualified, a reconsideration of college admissions and affirmative action. She is the recipient of numerous professional, civil rights, and teaching awards, as well as 8 honorary degrees at least. And she has co-created 2 online forums for the discussion of race, gender, and community engagement called racetalks.org and minerscanary.org. It is with great pleasure and pride that I ask you to join me in welcoming one of the most challenging and thought-provoking conversationalists and writers that I know, my friend Lani Guinier. Caroline Hoxby. Caroline Hoxby is Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where in 1994 she became the first African-American woman to earn that honor. Ladies and gentlemen. The Director of the Economics of Education Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, a MacArthur Genius Fellow, and a senior advisor at the Brookings Institution. She has written extensively on most, if not all, of the hot-button issues of our day, particularly those involving post-Brown education, including public school finance, private school vouchers, charter schools, teacher pay, college tuition, and competition. Professor Hoxby received her undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard, a master's degree at the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and her PhD from MIT. She's the author of the forthcoming book entitled Competitive New World, American Colleges and the Market, and the editor of the forthcoming book entitled College Decisions, The New Economics of Choosing, Attending, and Completing College. She edited The Economics of School Choice, a volume whose essays treat the subject of vouchers and choice with a cool empiricism that still manages to preserve the topic's heat. A peerless scholar of the questions under consideration this afternoon, Professor Hoxby also works outside the academy, testifying frequently for state governments and the federal government, and drafting legislation related to school financing and school choice. In the year 2003, she was nominated by President Bush and confirmed by the Senate to serve on the National Board of Education Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Hoxby. Abigail Thernstrom. Abigail Thernstrom has come to national prominence as a thinker and writer whose work embodies the mission of the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, where she's a senior fellow. And that mission is, and I quote, to develop and disseminate new ideas that foster greater economic choice and individual responsibility, unquote. Precise and provocative, Dr. Thernstrom has contributed regularly to the national conversation concerning the legacy of Brown v. Board, with pieces appearing in many, many outlets, among them Education Week and the LA Times. A member of the Massachusetts State Board of Education and a commissioner on the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Dr. Thernstrom is the author of the prize-winning book entitled Whose Votes Count? Affirmative Action and Minority Voting Rights. With her husband, my colleague, Harvard history professor Stephen Thernstrom, she's the co-author of 2 other books, America in Black and White, One Nation Indivisible, and No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap. And she's the co-editor of Beyond the Color Line, New Perspectives on Race and Ethnicity. Dr. Thernstrom has taught at Harvard, at Boston College and at Boston University. Through her books and articles in mainstream publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and frequent appearances on TV news programs and radio news programs, Dr. Thernstrom has become known as a foremost critic of affirmative action programs. Although she and I sometimes are on opposing sides of the op-ed page, I must say that her work helps us, and particularly helps me, to frame many of the questions that we need to be asking about the state of education after Brown. It is my pleasure to welcome Abigail Thernstrom to our forum. And finally, last but not least, the tree man himself. Our moderator, Charles Ogletree, is the author of All Deliberate Speed, Reflections on the First Half Century of Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a marvelous personal memoir and a sophisticated historical analysis of the subject that concerns us all this afternoon. As in all of his work, Charles brings to bear on the questions raised by Brown a wealth of scholarly research in and practical experience with the law. Charles is unsurpassed as a theorist and a practitioner of the law. Jesse Clemenco, professor of law and associate dean for clinical programs at the Harvard Law School, Charles rose from humble beginnings in, Merced? In Merced, California, to the heights of his profession, earning through his outspoken advocacy for equal rights under the law for all citizens, a national and indeed even an international platform. His earliest successes in the Merced public schools gained him admission to Stanford University, where he received both his bachelor's degree summa cum laude and his master's degrees. At the Harvard Law School, he served as special projects editor of the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review. Before entering the academy, Charles worked in the field as a public defender and then in private practice. In 1991, Professor Ogletree served as legal counsel to Professor Anita Hill during the national nightmare known as the Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Since then, Charles has remained a national authority on the intersection of race and the law in matters of both popular interest. He was a legal commentator for NBC during the O.J. Simpson trial, and historical importance. He's been at the fore of the fight for reparations for descendants of African American slaves. Charles, I keep waiting for my check. I go to the mailbox every day, brother. Charles is the co-author of the award-winning book entitled Beyond the Rodney King Story, an investigation of police conduct in minority communities. The recipient of numerous awards and honors and honorary degrees, Charles Ogletree was awarded the prestigious Charles Hamilton Houston Medallion of Merit from the Washington Bar Association, joining the ranks of Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall and William Brown. Frequent contributions to op-ed pages, books, and law reviews, and regular appearances on national news programs would seem to leave him little time for anything else. Charles also chairs the Board of Trustees of the University of the District of Columbia and the Board of the Bell Foundation, which funds after-school programs for minority children in a number of urban areas. He has also established a college scholarship fund for needy students in his hometown. There is no one, and I repeat, no one, more qualified to lead today's discussion than my friend Charles Ogletree. Give it up.
So much, and it's an honor to be here tonight with so many friends and family and people who are concerned about this issue. We're glad that the church is full. We apologize to the dozens of people who are outside who could not get in. We never anticipated this reaction, and it's good for the cause. We also want to let you know, if there's any question about it, we lose money on these events. We're not making anything on this event at all because it's an expensive thing to do, but it's important when we're here at Martha's Vineyard that we take time out to have a serious conversation about where we are as a nation and as a people. And we can do it here with a collection of people from all over the world who find time to sit back for just a moment to think about broad problems. And I couldn't think of a better panel to do that with tonight. And the whole title of this program is a trick question. Brown versus Board of Education, mission accomplished, question mark. And of course, the easy answer, everyone will say, no, it's not accomplished. But I want to try to press it a little bit. I want to start with Abigail Thernstrom to talk about Brown. If you talk to the lawyers who litigated this case, they will tell you that their ambition, their primary ambition was to eliminate the evil and awful system of Jim Crow segregation. We've lived with it for decades, following decades of slavery. And that mission was accomplished. The Supreme Court, in 2 unanimous decisions, said that we could no longer have racial segregation as a policy. It was no longer viable. And so we eliminated the colored-only fountains, the not eating in restaurants, unable to sleep at hotels, unable to vote. We eliminated the legal barrier to the Brown sought to eliminate it. Now, on the other hand, we see now that America looks very much, in some respects, like the America 50 years ago with resegregation in so many areas. So, Ms. Thernstrom, let me ask you first, in some sense, was the mission of Brown accomplished?
I'm so glad you started out with that question, Sheryll, because I think it is important to remember exactly what that brief and frustrating decision said. It was, you read the decision and you say to yourself, where's the beef? I mean, it is bare bones, and the sole topic, with the exception of one sentence, is de jure segregation, American apartheid in the South. And that era has indeed ended, and it's important to remember that. That the American South looked no different than South Africa under an apartheid regime. And those days are gone, and we should never forget that, because it is something to celebrate, that in an almost, not entirely, but basically peaceful revolution, we have ended a most terrible time. On the other hand, there was one sentence in the decision that rightly raised larger hopes, raised a dream. And that sentence referred to equal educational opportunity. Now, in the context, clearly, the Supreme Court only meant opportunity in the sense of busting open doors of schools that had been closed to black children. Again, it was talking about de jure segregation. But rightly, Americans with Brown, starting with Brown, had larger dreams of an education system and indeed of a nation in which there was true racial equality. And if we concentrate for a minute just on the question of education, we have today a heartbreaking racial gap in academic achievement, which, little plug for myself, is the subject of my last co-authored book, No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning. At the end of high school, most of you must know this, at the end of high school, the typical black child is 4 years behind the typical white or Asian student. The average black student doing less well than 80% of his or her white or Asian classmates. If we look at those at the very top of the scale, and this is all undisputed federal data, the National Center for Educational Progress. If we look, for instance, at how many black students score in the advanced category in math, it's 0.2% of black students scoring in the top category in math. The figure for whites is 11 times higher. The figure for Asians is 37 times higher. And these numbers could obviously roll up a lot of numbers, but the bottom line is very clear. We have children, racially identifiable children, Black and Latino, in this country, who are educational have-nots, who do not have the skills and knowledge to do well in American society. Skills and knowledge today are the key to racial equality. Those with skills and equal skills and knowledge have equal earnings down the road, whatever their color. That was not true in yesterday's America. It is true in today's America.
Let me ask you a question about that aspect of Abigail. Who is responsible? There may be a lot of people. Who's responsible for this racial gap, for creating it, and who's responsible to identify for solving it?
Well, there are...
Does that include government among the entities who should be responsible both for creating it and solving it?
Well, there obviously, this is a mess that took a long time getting into, and of course, basically, Black kids were not educated in the Jim Crow South to a great extent, and there was, I would argue, though I can't statistically prove it, that some of the radical disconnect from the world of learning that we see in Black kids today is an inheritance from that history. But the important question, it seems to me, is not who to blame and exactly, what all the factors that went into making this tragedy are, but where do we go from here? How do we walk forward so that tomorrow's kids really do live in a world of racial equality? And the ongoing fact is that too many public schools in America today, and particularly the urban schools, are not providing the kind of education that the students need, the most disadvantaged students need, particularly the have-nots who come to school and need superb education and are getting very mediocre education. And this is not, there's nothing essential about that. There's no excuse for it, which is why we call in our book No Excuses. No excuse for it. We can do better. But to do better is going to take a radical reconstruction of American education. And I hope Caroline Hoxby will talk more about that. She and I are on the same page on this question. And
you have specific, who can solve the problem? You said the urban educational schools are part of the problem. Who can solve that?
Well, a lot of the problem has to be solved politically, and if it's going to be solved politically, that is, if there's going to be a real movement to change schools, it's got to come from parents. It's got to come from voters. There's got to be anger. It is time to get angry about the racial gap in academic learning, because these are not, whatever your color, these are not somebody else's kids. They're all our kids, and they are the future of America.
Let me ask Professor Cashin to answer the same question. I want to add a couple of other facts. You clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall, and he firmly believed that Brown was about more than just ending racial segregation. In fact, some of his most bitter opinions were as a justice of the Supreme Court. And he thought that whether in the Rodriguez case in Texas in 1973 or the Milliken versus Gravel case in Detroit in 1974 or Bakke in 1978, he thought that Brown had true educational opportunity, the resources had not been met. What's your sense about whether or not Justice Marshall, and you believe that Brown was about ending segregation as opposed to a broader mission?
I'm sorry, so what's my sense about what Justice Marshall felt?
His view as well as your own.
About
whether Brown was more than just ending racial segregation. But
yeah, I mean, I never had a direct conversation with him about this, but in the year I clerked for him, which was his last active year on the court, we had a school desegregation case, and in that context, we talked a lot about it. And my sense was that integration was not the end in itself. It was a means to greater educational opportunity. And I think his dissent in that case reflected that. So absolutely, he was devastated near the end of his life with the failure of America to live up to the soul of Brown, but he felt that it was the right vision.
Your sense now, you've written this book about the failures of integration. What is the failure?
Well, let me just say very quickly, I do think there's one chief success of Brown and the civil rights revolution that followed it, that, 50 years later, the vast majority of Americans of all race will say in opinion polls, I think they're sincere, that they believe America should be a free, open, integrated, and democratic society where no one is limited in their access to anything based on race. And that's a majoritarian consensus in American society today, and that's very different from the racial caste system that prevailed 50 years ago, and we ought to applaud that. The main failure is...
Let me ask you before you move on now. That's too easy. You were my student now.
I was.
And a very good student.
Thank you. He gave me an A in criminal law.
So you were, as life has proven. Here's the problem with that. John Payton and Gay McDougall were in South Africa at the end of apartheid, and they said almost every white person that they ran into said, you know what, I really didn't believe in apartheid. I didn't believe in it. I was just part of the system. If we talk to people about American segregation, they would say, I was not an advocate of segregation. I thought that we should have had more integration. Can you believe views when people say, I don't believe in the system that I lived in, that I prospered from? Can you really believe that the polls today that you're citing so that people really believe that Brown is a good thing, if, as we all document, there was massive resistance across the nation to the whole idea of integration?
I think Americans believe in the value of Brown in the abstract.
Okay.
In
Not
the abstract.
Not in my
when
neighborhood.
it comes to their actual life choices.
Right.
I think most people, we live in a society premised on separatism. We have a society because of a lot of conscious public policy choices that sets up winner and loser communities and winner and loser schools and even winner and loser tracks within schools. And in that separatist system, individuals, everybody is scratching and clawing to make sure that they and their children get or stay in the winner column. So we have a system that makes individuals have to be ruthless. I applaud Abigail's statement that all kids are our children, but we have a society that doesn't give people the luxury of caring about other people's children. So I think people believe in these values in the abstract, but our public policies and the way society is ordered makes it very, very difficult for individuals to go against self-interest. Or to give up advantage, particularly if you're a person who succeeded in getting into that winner column.
Give us a short overview of, when you talk about the segregation, what you've seen in your work in terms of residential segregation, how that has played out as an unfortunate vestige of Brown, how our communities look today.
Well, the average segregation, racial segregation increased steadily in the first 7 decades of the 20th century, and again, because of conscious public policy choices. And the end result
of that... What do you mean by conscious public policy choices? Who was...
I'll try to say this as briefly as possible. The Federal Housing Administration, propagated the orthodoxy that neighborhoods should be homogeneous, that we won't underwrite any mortgages in an integrated neighborhood where you have races and classes mixing. That's unhealthy for property values. So they required that, any mortgage that for 35 years they did this, and the 2/3 of all mortgages, they required that racially restricted covenants be attached to the code. And that orthodoxy, that homogeneity, found its way into real estate markets such that even today, if you look, everybody here, just get in the car and drive, and you see this, the way in which neighborhoods are developed. There are neighborhoods for people who can afford this kind of house at this level, and at this level, and this level. It's become the orthodoxy, and there's zoning powers. We have a religion of local autonomy. We have more local governments per capita in America than any Western nation. Why? Because if you incorporate a new town, you gain control over your socioeconomic investment through the zoning code. Most new suburban towns don't have affordable housing, don't have apartments. So this is what I mean by conscious public policy choices. I've lost the question now.
Let me just ask one other part of that then. To what extent, some of this you talk about this segregation. Is there anyone to blame? What about choices? You talk a lot about the fact that African Americans choose to live in communities with other African Americans. Is that racist?
Right. No. Let me just clarify the end effect of all these policies. African Americans are the most racially segregated group, in America. Racially segregated minority. Actually, the most racially segregated group are white Americans. They live the most racially isolated existence. But that's true today. Even if you are above a certain income, there's a lot of what I essentially say in this book is America has not yet come to terms with black people that exist in large numbers. And there's still a great deal of fear when it comes to African Americans. And sort of public policies reflect that. Now, is it racist for African Americans to say, hey, I've tried immigration, been there, done that, I'd rather just live with my own people? I don't have a problem with that. But what I'm saying is that American society and public policies actually give individuals, including black people, very few choices. And for black people, the main choice you have in housing markets is either an overwhelmingly black community or one where blacks are very few. And it's not surprising that a lot of African Americans would find an overwhelmingly black community more attractive than an overwhelmingly white one. I think a lot of African Americans are weary of carrying the assimilator's burden and would prefer to go to a community that's welcoming to themselves and their children.
Thank you very much. Professor Hoxby, let me ask you this. Has Brown met his mission in another way? Now there are pockets of interest in urban markets for alternative educational options. You have written about and talked about African American families wanting vouchers, talking about alternatives, talking about getting out of the failed public school system, talking about resources alone may not solve a problem. What's your sense about whether Brown's created some new options for African Americans as opposed to shut off opportunity?
I think one of the exciting things about Brown is if you actually go back to that time and you look at the Brown decision and you look at the lawyers standing outside the Supreme Court, they were excited. They thought things were going to change right away. And I think two major public policy things came out of Brown. One was desegregation itself, and the other was increasing the equality of resources across poor schools and rich schools, black schools and white schools across neighborhoods. And I think realistically, we have pretty much exhausted the ability of those two types of public policies to change things a lot for black students in the United States. It is still the case that although there's no de jure segregation, black students are very isolated in schools because of de facto segregation. And in terms of the worst schools in the United States, the most chaotic, the schools where no learning is going on, the schools with high dropout rates, the schools that are just completely dysfunctional, those schools are very disproportionately attended by black students. And I think we can look to a bit of history to understand why that we tolerate that in the United States. But that doesn't give us an answer for going forward. Let me tell you why I think we tolerate it, and let me tell you what I think we need to change a little bit. I think we tolerate it because we have a long history of black students not doing very well in schools in the United States. That's because in the, what Abigail called the apartheid era in the South, they weren't given enough resources to do well, and they didn't have proper schools, they didn't have long school years, they didn't have much of anything. And so people got accustomed to the idea that black students just don't do that well in school. And I think today, if you see a black student and he or she is a high school dropout, people don't immediately turn to the school and say, hey, what in the world did you do wrong, that kid? I mean, obviously you did something wrong. Instead, they look at the child and they say, well, something probably went wrong with that kid. We can't really expect that. And therefore, they don't blame the school. If you were to take a white suburban kid and have him dropping out of school, people would turn to the school and say, hey, what did you do wrong? And this happened a lot of the time, with 45 or 50% of the students in the school. Some people would definitely say, what are you doing wrong in the school? I don't think we ask that question of a lot of inner city schools where dropout rates are high, where lots of kids graduate who really can't read and are illiterate. I just don't think we can tolerate that in the future because there are a lot of numerate people and a lot of literate people around the world who are going to do the jobs that skilled Americans are doing right now, and they will take our jobs. So I think going forward, we have to just decide this isn't acceptable. In terms of what can be done today, I think that the most promising reforms are things that are not going to appeal to our sense of nostalgia about Brown versus Board of Education. They're going to be things like school choice, accountability, and other types of education reforms that really attempt to change the environment for a lot of disadvantaged kids in the United States. And these are basically get tough policies that are not going to make us feel entirely comfortable. But I think we have to be open-minded towards them. And one of the things that I think every one of us can do, we don't actually work in these schools or attend these schools ourselves probably, is to decide that we're going to be open-minded to different types of public policies because parents of inner city kids are in favor of these things because they want opportunities. They want to be able to make choices for themselves. They want to be able to make changes for their kids. And the politics of it are not that they're holding things back, but rather that we're holding things back to a large extent.
Let me ask you a question about that. You said we need to think about more get tough policies. How can we get any tougher? What is it that we're lacking in the rigor of demanding from students or parents that you are proposing?
I don't think it's that we're not being tough enough. Students and their parents face the real consequences. If you don't do well in school, you face life consequences. So in that sense, every student faces consequences. But what I don't think is the case is that schools face very many consequences, right? A school that is performing much, much worse, given the sort of kids it gets, than the neighboring schools really faces no consequences at all. Nobody gets fired. Very few people lose their jobs. No one gets paid less than the person in the next school. And we don't reward even the schools that are succeeding the most. I was recently in a wonderfully successful inner city school in Florida where the principal is struggling because as he does better and better, his county is taking more and more resources from him because they say, well, you're actually doing pretty well. So we're going to take away some of those programs that you have and put them into other schools. Well, that's not much of a reward system because his teachers are, of course, upset about this. So, that's the sort of thing that we should not accept. And I think we have to be a little open-minded to changes, like the fact that maybe this principal should be allowed to pay his teachers more than other teachers in order to keep them there.
I want to come back later to the No Child Left Behind for all of you, but let me ask you one more question for the rest of the year. Have we been spending too much time trying to see the paradigm as a race paradigm and not enough time seeing the paradigm as a class paradigm in terms of looking after Brown who are today? Your research seems to say that we need to be careful about our emphasis. Can you say a little bit about Brown in the context of which was raised and your sense that maybe we need to shift our thinking a little bit?
I think I'd say this is a little bit different on the K-12 level versus the higher education level. In elementary and secondary schooling, it is the case that the worst schools in the United States are associated with kids who are poor, but they are also very disproportionately associated with kids who are Black and Hispanic. So it's not just poverty, and you can't just look at poverty and see bad schools. There will be worse schools, all else equal, if the kids are attending are Black and Hispanic. That being said, with higher education, I think the problems are more more about income, family income, parents' education, than they are just about race and ethnicity. If you look at poor white kids in the United States, they don't go to selected colleges or private colleges really any more than black or Hispanic students do of the same income. So in terms of opening up opportunities to higher education, especially selective college educations, that's a lot out of place.
Professor Guinier, your sense, you've written a lot before and after the 50th anniversary of Brown, including serious critiques of Brown. Your sense of whether or not the mission has been accomplished?
So I was introduced as the person who is challenging and provocative, and I'll try and live up to that introduction. I don't think it's a binary question as to whether Brown accomplished its mission, because you first have to ask, what was the mission of Brown? And I have not heard the same answer from all of the panelists, and I'm sure if we interviewed all the people in the audience, we would have very different views as to what the mission was of Brown. I worry that when we think about Brown and we celebrate Brown, that for most white Americans, if you were to do one of the surveys that Sheryll was talking about, they would say Brown's mission has been accomplished. And in fact, we heard people on the panel say that Brown's mission has been accomplished, that we eliminated de facto or at least de jure, Jim Crow segregation, and that was the mission of Brown. I don't think that for many of the black people who put their hopes and faith in the lawyers who were litigating Brown, that they were simply interested in eliminating de jure segregation. For many people, Brown and the idea of desegregation was a means to a greater end. And the greater end was not simply lifting the barriers that the law had imposed, but lifting the barriers that our economic and social structure had imposed. And those barriers were legitimated by the law, but once the law changed and did not legitimate those barriers, it doesn't mean the barriers were themselves lifted. And the problem for me in thinking about Brown is that we have misunderstood the role that racism has played in the history of this country, not only before Brown, but since Brown. We seem to think that we can separate race and class. I don't think we can separate race and class. So when Tree asked, well, is it race or is it class? It's both, because race is a means for masking class. Race becomes the language of class. So we can talk about race, but in fact we also need to understand class. Now, one of the things that Caroline Hoxby talked about is why do we tolerate the terrible statistics that you heard from all of the panelists? And one of her answers was, well, black kids were denied many opportunities, and Caroline, I apologize if I'm misstating what you said, but because of the long history of black students not doing well, we don't expect the same thing from black students. Well, I just want to read you about how some white students were not doing well in the 1940s and 1950s, but we seem to still expect good things of white students, right? So I do worry, for example, in 1940, nearly 3/4 of the wealthiest 17-year-olds in the South, but less than 1/6 of the poorest, had completed at least 11 years of schooling. The state-by-state percentages of functional illiterates, defined as people with less than 5 years of schooling for whites on farms in the 1950 census, overlapped with those for blacks in cities. So one of the things we have to understand is that not all white people are doing well. Not all black people are doing poorly. But we use the language of race to avoid talking about what is happening in terms of class. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about race, because race is the only language that we are fluent in. So we therefore have to become equally fluent in the grammar and syntax of race, not just the vocabulary of race. So I just want to tell a really short story about what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, because I think it helps to capture my worry about having a more complex and nuanced conversation. So those of us who remember Little Rock and who saw all of those white parents angry, that mob of people angry at these 9 black children who were so well dressed and so well prepared to go to Central High School. Well, many of us, certainly I was, my family, were angry at those white people who were not allowing these black children to have an opportunity. But the story is a little more complicated. When these black children were getting ready to go to Central High School, which was the previously all-white high school in Little Rock, the very same summer, a new all-white high school was being opened in the most affluent suburbs, or it's not even the suburbs, it's still part of the most affluent section of Little Rock. It was called Hall High School. That high school siphoned off all of the affluent white kids, the kids whose parents were doctors and lawyers, at the same time that Central High School was now going to be open to black kids. So you had Horace Mann, which was the all-black school. Now you have Hall High School. Not only is it all white, but is rich and all white. And then you have Central High School. Now many of those white parents who were upset about what was happening at Central were confusing racial integration with downward economic mobility. They saw what was happening in economic terms, but the only language that they knew was race. And so they were angry at the black kids coming in, but they didn't express the same anger, although I'm sure they felt it at the affluent white kids who were leaving. They had seen Central High School as the opportunity for their kids, these poor and working class white kids, to move up in the world and to enjoy the same opportunities as the kids whose parents were doctors and lawyers. Now, this pattern of affluent whites fleeing and leaving the problem to be negotiated between blacks and poor whites was not only true in Little Rock, but you saw it in Boston, you saw it all over the country. Now, when people talk about Detroit, many of us think, oh, well, there were riots in Detroit in 1967, and that's when all the white people fled. That is not true. I recommend to you a book by Thomas Sugrue, S-U-G-R-U-E, who wrote a book called The Origins of the Urban Crisis, who talks about what was happening in Detroit in the 50s and the 60s, well before the 67 riots, in which white people, again, were using many of the policies that Sheryll described to flee to more affluent suburbs that then used exclusionary zoning to create these bastions of privilege. And if we don't learn how to talk about race and class in the same sentence, we will be here 50 years from now asking the same question.
Dr. Thernstrom, let me ask you to respond. Professor Guinier's talk about racism as a problem, and that we need to look deeper than the Supreme Court's ending racial segregation as the issue in Brown v. Yard. Your response.
Well, first place, let me correct something that you said about my remarks. I simply, in describing Brown versus Ford 50 years ago, a very different historical context, was talking about what the subject was in Brown. I did not for a minute, and do not believe, did not for a minute suggest that larger dreams should not have grown out of Brown. Of course they should have grown out of Brown, and they were inevitable. And I mean, one of the interesting facts about Brown, and and important to the historical context is that white opinion had begun to change already, even in the South in the 1940s. That shift in white racial attitudes, this is the start of it, was very important to the eventual acceptance many years later. I mean, even 10 years after Brown, we had no school desegregation in the Deep South. But, you know, we did pass the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act. Shifts in public opinion on the subject of race have been very important to making America a very different place than it was 50 years ago. Are there still racists in America? Of course there will be racists in America. This will never be a squeaky clean society on the subject of race, and no other society in the world will be either. But if we look at international comparisons of attitudes towards minorities within our borders, America comes, you know, attitudes of Germans towards Turks, French towards Algerians, whatever. America comes off wonderfully well. We have got a lot to be proud of, as well as a lot of work to do. And I would never deny the fact that there is much work to be done. So I was a little bothered by the description of my remarks. Let's say a couple of things. Look, Professor Guinier said, kind of objected to the notion of group averages. Now, we have to talk about group averages. Nobody's uncomfortable talking about group averages when we're talking about the level of black unemployment. Nobody's uncomfortable talking about group averages when we're talking about the appalling number of young black men in prison. Group averages, you're never talking about everybody, but they're important in drawing a picture of American society and pointing to the work that needs to be done. And of course there are class issues. We don't pay enough attention to class in American society. But we should never forget that race remains the American dilemma. It remains the issue, the deeply wounding issue that this country cannot seem to really get on top of. It is the ground on which we lose our footing. And so it's important to talk about race, and it is not useful to make, for instance, as we did for so many years, it a hush-hush subject that we have a racial gap in academic achievement, because we don't talk about problems that they are not addressed and they are not solved. I think it's also very important when we talk about a changed America to remember that half of blacks today are in the middle class, a third are living in suburbia. The black rate of suburbanization has been much greater than the white rate. This is to be applauded, and the trends need to continue. We're nowhere where we need to be. The black poverty rate is much too high still. It is, of course, in part a reflection of the percentage of single-parent households in the black community. That's another subject which we have to be willing to talk about. But I don't know, Charles, have I answered your question?
Yes. Chris Hoxby?
I want to try and get some interaction amongst us, and I'm going to ask Professor Guinier. Let's say we take seriously the notion that we're going to talk about change, well, the public policy debate, if we actually do consider race and class together all the time. I mean, what public policy would you change? That's what I want to see something change. So I'm trying to get at the nuts and bolts of what it is that's race and class together.
There's so many. Let me try to think of one that would be responsive. I think, for example, what Abigail just said, the black rate of suburbanization is higher than the white rate, right? Is that what you said?
I did.
Okay. So Abigail did say the black rate of suburbanization is higher than the white rate.
Yes, I mean,
but do we know to which are moving, and are we to assume something from that statement that I think may in fact be a little misleading in terms of what's happening to black people? That's part of my point. But having said that, I also worry about how that masks poverty in the white community. And if you are looking at any kind of statistic, you will find, yes, black people who are poor, single-parent families, who live in urban areas that have been devastated by government policies, and I would invite Sheryll to talk in even more graphic detail about some of the policies that she describes in her excellent book, The Failures of Integration, which she can hold up for you right there. Read chapter 3. But on the other hand, I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that there are poor whites who are also struggling. And my point is this: if we don't talk in a language that poor whites can understand, they are going to be race-baited, and they are going to be convinced that their problems somehow are all about black people who are now experiencing a higher rate of suburbanization than white people.
We're going to be going to audience questions in about 7 minutes. There's a microphone here. I'm going to start. We're going to get questions back, front, center. So you'll take this one. You'll take this one. Does someone take a third microphone? So get the microphones. And we're going to start back, front, center in just a few minutes.
Yeah, if I could interject. I do talk about race and class, starting with the title of the book. And I have to concur with what Lani's saying, but I think it's not just that we have to be underscoring to poor whites how they are disadvantaged by a lot of public policies that are animated by fear and animus toward black people. It's not just poor whites. It's the vast majority of Americans. You know, what I argue in this book, I have an entire chapter in my book called The Cost to Whites, the cost of white separatism. You know, what I'm arguing is that the only people in American society who are truly achieving the American dream are those people who can buy their way into what I call these gold standard neighborhoods, which are really only about 7% of the metropolitan population. These gold standard neighborhoods, communities that have the best of everything and the worst of nothing. They have the highest job growth, they have excellent public schools, they have very low crime, virtually no poverty, and everybody else who can't afford to get into that community gets a very different deal. And the white middle class, I think is the group that is most likely to be lulled into the belief that America really is this land of opportunity. And I try to underscore, so what are some of the costs that white people experience in a separatist America, in a segregated America? Housing costs. The majority white neighborhood, on average, costs about 43% more, at least in the Detroit area, but a lot of those places, it costs a lot more than an integrated community. So you pay for your separatism in terms of housing costs. There's a run-up in bankruptcies in this country because parents feel this most. You have to get into the good neighborhoods with the good schools, which means poverty-free neighborhoods where there are no black kids. And those neighborhoods are extremely expensive, particularly in the metropolitan areas that have a large population of black people. If you have a metropolitan area where more than 20% of the people in the metropolitan area are black, you have these stark patterns of segregation, and white people are killing themselves to get into the good neighborhoods. So you pay for it in housing costs, you pay for it in private school if you don't have coverage in the public school system, you pay for it if you can't afford the gold standard neighborhoods, you pay for it in terms of commuting costs. People who live in the suburban fringe are more at risk of death due to accidents than people who live in the central city, even with the higher crime rates in the central city. Why? Because you have a life of existence in the park. So I lay out these things, until we have people understand that, everybody is harmed by a society that's premised on fear and exclusion, rather than, dare I say it, love and inclusion. We won't begin to pursue saner public policies until everybody understands how this.
We're going to be taking questions from the audience. Before we do that, Barack Obama is here to make some remarks to the audience, and then we'll take all your questions and have a dialogue. So I'm going to go get him as get us prepared to introduce him.
Okay. And he's downstairs? Yeah. But give it up to the panelists. Welcome.
And we will take 3 questions for him before I go to the panel questions. We have the 3 mics. There's one mic right here, and one in the center, and one in the mic on the left side. Okay. Start with the question on the left side. You got the mic right here? Yes.
Johnny Lewis tells a beautiful story of someone that I think combines the sense of community you're talking about, in which the legal process cannot do it all. And he goes to see her, and he's very afraid of storms. And he's there with several of his cousins, and they're out in the yard, and the storm comes up. And she gathers them in the house, in the shack. And the storm comes, and the wind whips up, and one side of the shack, they're huddled in fear. And one side of the shack blows up, and she takes the 12 or 13 cousins, and they go and stand in that side of the house so the storm won't blow that room off the house. And then the wind picks up on the other side of the house, and they do the same thing. And Johnny Lewis's point is that it's community and getting folks to go together. I'm from a state that needs to be in the blue collar desperately, and we're not, Mississippi. And yet, 45% of our people are children on Medicaid. And if we could get the middle class and poor whites to vote with our African American friends, we could do it. But there are wedge issues out there that are being exploited. And I just want to commend you, and really, no question, but thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you. All right. Question, question on the right side, right here.
Good evening. My name is Phyllis Green. I'm a professional educator. And as a teacher, I'm encountering not only African Americans, as a matter of fact, right now, the majority of my students is Hispanic or Latino descent. And I would think the Brown decision, I had to explain to them the whole issue about the Brown decision. And I explained to them that it's affecting their education as well. Most of them came from Puerto Rico or Mexico. And without that decision, I doubt if they would be here. How do you address the whole issue of minorities, women, African Americans, Latino, Asians being affected by the Brown decision?
You got some critics. Let me say 2 things before Senator Obama leaves. This book is available, Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance. It's outside. It'll be available for book signing with all the other panelists book signing. And those of you who've asked about making contributions to his campaign, so Obama for Illinois, he can't accept checks. He, in fact, is on vacation. But I can accept checks. I will accept checks. And I'll be outside at the end of the program. And again, just thank Senator Barack Obama for all of this. We have a few minutes for questions and reception starting almost immediately. Yes. And all the panelists will be here signing books or at the reception. Yes, quick question.
First of all, I'm an orthopedic surgeon and I'm a product of the inner city schools. and I talk to kids in inner city schools.
Please keep quiet.
And the first question I ask them when I speak to them, this is what I do in my spare time, I talk to kids. First question I ask them is, why are you here? I ask the kids, why are you here? And I never, ever get the right answer. Ever. I ask the kids, what do you want to be? What are you going to do with your lives? And 90% of the black males say they want to be either an athlete or a rapper.
Okay, here's the question.
I'm coming.
Okay.
I'm coming. Okay. Let me see. I contend that although Brown opened doors for our kids, many of them will not choose to walk through those doors. And I understand that Professor Gates and Professor Ogletree and Professor Guinier and this panel are working to open doors. But what can we do to get people to walk through those doors after you open them if they think that there's no chance for them to use school as a means to better themselves?
Okay, who wants to answer that question? Quick response. Abigail Thernstrom?
Well,
you're on.
Okay. I blame in part the schools for delivering a message to black kids that what they should hope to be are athletes or rappers. I went into what was reported to be a very good school last year in Newark, New Jersey, and as I come in the door, there is a huge picture of a black athlete. This was an all-black school. I had to fit with the principal, and he was totally bewildered that I had to fit. Schools have a very important role in delivering messages to kids, and it is true that schools can only open doors. The kids have to walk through them. They can't walk through them for them. But schools, again, can play a role in telling kids, look, we will open doors for you, and they truly have to open doors. They have to be good schools. Only you can walk through them, but we'll be there for you day and night, and we'll show you how to walk through them, and we're going to show you where you're going to go if you do walk through them. And that, however, is going to require, on your part, as Barack Obama said, turning off that television and burning the midnight oil, as Dr. King said.
Next question over to the left.
Hi. Sometimes I feel very lucky and very blessed as one of the people who has benefited from Brown. But I look around and I see where there should be more opening.
I'm having trouble hearing you. Could you put the mic to you?
Okay. I'm about to graduate from one of the nation's top law schools, and there are no black men in my class. And this is a stark failure to me. But I want to know, for the youth who are struggling to go through those doors that have been opened, what do we do to make sure that more people follow us? Where do we go, and what actions do we take to make sure that in 20 years we're not here in the same place?
Who wants to come, Professor Hoxby?
Well, I think one of the things that I really would like to have people come out of this evening with is some ideas about what we need to do in the future. And I do think that we have to change the culture of low academic expectations in schools in the United States. That's one of the key things to do. If you look at No Child Left Behind, its implementation may be imperfect, but one of the best things about that law is that it does say the following thing: no child should be left behind. Every child should be expected to be proficient in math and reading and science by a specific year. I mean, it actually says we want to get there by infinite time, by 2013, which is, a year that's going to be reached. So I think we have to have a culture of high expectations for all kids, and that means sometimes saying to a school, look, it may be fun to do field trips, and it may be fun to have your kids, do sports stuff, but the reality is that the thing they need the most is to learn math and learn English, and if they do those things, everything else will follow. And some of this is kind of a tough love message, but I don't think we're going to get there with empathy alone. I'm not against empathy. I'm pro-empathy, but I think empathy also means being tough with expectations for kids.
Okay, next question over here.
Yes, everything that we've been talking about tonight relates to the important issue of electing officials, public officials, that are going to implement public policy to get us all the progress that we expect. And I'd like to ask the voting rights question. Are we going to have a repetition in 2004 as we had in 2000? Down in the state of Florida, during the past several weeks, they have been, the state police have actually been suppressing registration drives by African American groups. And I'd like to know what's going to be done about that, and are we really going to be facing the same thing again, where we're suppressing people's rights to vote, to give us the things we're looking for.
Any quick comment you want to respond to that?
I would just refer you to another elected official from Illinois, Jesse Jackson Jr., who was trying to push for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. You may not, or many people in the audience may not realize that there is nothing in the United States Constitution that guarantees every citizen the right to vote. It is a state right, it is not an American right, and part of the problem that you're describing is that we have delegated this responsibility to 50 different communities or states to regulate the right to vote. So a long-term solution is to think about having a constitutional amendment that actually guarantees the right to vote using a national set of regulations, not just state. Obviously, in the short term between now and November, what you're doing and what Bob Herbert is doing in the New York Times is really important to make this visible, because what is happening in Florida is just the tip of the iceberg.
We've got time, just 5 more minutes total. We've got center, left, and right, just one question, and then the panelists will be here at the reception, which you're all invited to, which is right outside the tent, I think, to your right. So 5 more minutes, quick questions, quick answers, and then you can continue the conversation outside, yes. I'm sorry, here.
Everything that you said today has been about the terrible effects of the unequal distribution of wealth in American society. And it seems very clear listening to you that even if blacks were to come up from the bottom, other people will be coming in at the bottom, as long as you remain as unequal as you do, and as long as the rewards for success at the top, the competition that Sheryll was talking about, are as phenomenal as they are in America, and as long as the penalties for failing are as dire as they are in America. Is any political party here ever going to come up with a logical answer to that, which is higher taxes, more redistribution? Well, it's not a question that you cannot ask in America today.
Sheryl,
several times people talk about public policy, what we should do, and I just want to advocate that I do have a chapter in my book saying what to do about it with a number of public policies, but nothing remotely progressive will happen in this country unless we really return to grassroots mobilization, educate people about what their enlightened self-interest is, and grassroots mobilization across boundaries of race and class. Now, yes, there's been just a series of public policies that particularly through the tax code, that have been creating more inequality and unequal distributions of wealth. And in fact, so much of our public policies involve a redistribution toward people who are wealthy. But nothing is going to change unless we do the hard work of building coalitions, strong, sustained organizations at the grassroots level that are lobbying for a different future.
Question on the left, and then the final question on the right.
The panel addressed the issue a lot about abstract values versus concrete realities, de jure victories versus de facto situations. And I know one of the methods used to measure success is going to be accountability. And that term concerns me considerably. I work for the mental health system in New York State, and I just want to say paperwork has nothing to do with progress or productivity. Paperwork can destroy treatment, can destroy interventions. What type of valid indicators, what type of accountability could be set up to really measure true progress, true productivity?
Who wants to respond to that one?
Democracy.
Abigail, good response?
I'm really serious.
If you're talking about education, the bottom line is very clear. What do the students know? And if students cannot read by 3rd grade, have basic math skills, they need to have basic literacy skills, and they will not do well in American society if they don't do them, and the standards-based tests give us that information.
You know, I think schools are a little different than other things because we've measured students' outcomes for a long time. Accountability is not so much about do we try to figure out whether a third grader can read or not, because we've always tried to figure that out, right? I think it's really about trying to hold schools to a standard and say, look, you shouldn't be promoting third graders into the fourth grade who can't read. That just is not acceptable. Okay, it's not that you shouldn't have been measuring the third graders' reading skills all along. You should have been measuring them all along. But now we're going to expose the fact that you're promoting a whole bunch of kids who can't read into the fourth grade. And I think that makes it a little different than some other organizations. Schools have been, piling up the paper for years. But now we want to make that paper translate into some changes. And that means, one of the great things about accountability is that people suddenly say, my gosh, no one is learning to read in the following school, and they focus on that. And I think it's going to be the origin of a lot of redistribution towards disadvantaged kids in the United States. Because if you don't know how bad they're doing, how do you know what sort of resources they need, right? If you don't know that they're not learning to read and write, how are you going to know that it's a crisis? So I think it's all about exposure and not that much about new paper.
Last question?
It's about exposure, however.
Let me get the last question on the table. Go ahead. Stand up here so the kids can hear you.
What role should affirmative action play in trying to implement Brown for the future?
Okay, quick comments. What role should affirmative action play? Abigail?
I no longer talk about affirmative action. I'm interested in getting kids by the end of high school to a level playing field. That is the issue. The whole issue of racial double standards, it seems to me it's an awful issue. I no longer want to talk about it. I do want to say one more word on the accountability question, just adding to what Carol Hoxby said, which is, look, and accountability means that teachers who are not teaching the kids are out. The principals who are not running good schools are out. Those schools should be closed. That's what real accountability is. Asking
Please join me in thanking all of our panelists and their comments. All of the panelists will be doing book signings right outside. There's a reception. We have a closing remark from Professor Davis.
My only closing remark is, let's thank Charles Ogletree for being a great